Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be exploring something that's been around for centuries.
Yeah.
The not guilty by reason of insanity plea.
Wow, yeah.
It might seem like just an old legal term, but it all stems back to this really interesting case in London in the 1840s.
Okay.
The case of Daniel McNaughton, and it still has a huge impact on how courts handle cases that involve mental health.
Yeah, it really is amazing how one case can just have like this lasting impact.
Totally.
Especially when you consider how much our understanding of mental health has changed
Yeah.
since like the 1840s.
Absolutely. So we're going to get into McNaughton's story in detail, but we're also going to look at how the definition of insanity has evolved legally.
Okay.
We're going to look at the criticism surrounding it and how these precedents affect our understanding of mental health in the justice system.
Yeah, it's really important to remember that these aren't just like abstract legal concepts, right?
Yeah.
This has a really real impact on people's lives, on families, on how we as a society think about crime and punishment.
Right, yeah. Okay, so let's travel back to 1843
Okay.
and set the scene a little bit.
All right.
Daniel McNaughton, this wood turner from Scotland, shot and killed Edward Drummond on the streets of London.
Oh, wow.
And Drummond was the secretary to the Prime Minister,
Yeah.
Robert Peel, at the time. And McNaughton actually thought he was shooting the Prime Minister.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So this wasn't a random act.
Right.
McNaughton had been dealing with some really severe paranoia
Okay.
and delusions. For quite a while, he thought he was being persecuted by the Tory party,
Really?
and even by the Prime Minister himself.
Wow.
Yeah, there are accounts of him doing some really strange things before the shooting,
Oh, really?
like complaining to the police about people following him, claiming they were trying to poison him,
Wow.
and even traveling all over Europe because he thought they were still after him.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, so all these details are
Yeah.
really important because they give us a look into McNaughton's state of mind. Yeah. Leading up to this crime, but it also highlights the challenges of trying to figure out what someone's mental state was.
Right.
Way back then, especially when our understanding of mental health was so different
Yeah. Yeah.
from what it is now.
Totally different.
Yeah, it's almost like trying to put together a puzzle.
Okay.
Where you don't have all the pieces.
Yeah.
We've got these fragments of information, his statements, his actions.
Right.
But can we really ever know what was actually going on in his mind in that exact moment?
It's a really good question. And that is exactly what the jury had to deal with during his trial.
Yeah.
Right? Like, was he truly insane at the time of this, or was he just a man driven by malice
Yeah.
and political motives?
So this is where this concept of insanity in the legal world
Okay.
becomes important. And it's a word that gets used a lot, but in the law, it means something very specific.
Yeah. In the eyes of the law, insanity doesn't just mean that someone has a mental illness.
Right.
It refers to a mental state where a person can't understand what their actions are really about
Yeah.
and what the consequences are.
Yeah.
They can't tell what's right and wrong.
Yeah, and it was McNaughton's sanity that became the biggest focus of the trial.
Right.
His defense said that he was so delusional that he couldn't be responsible for what he did.
Okay.
But obviously the prosecution said something different.
Right.
They said McNaughton knew what he was doing and acted intentionally.
Okay. So what happened?
The jury actually sided with the defense.
Wow.
They found McNaughton not guilty by reason of insanity.
Oh, wow.
But this caused a huge public outcry.
Really?
People were outraged, and they demanded a clearer definition of what legal insanity actually meant.
Wow, I bet.
Even Queen Victoria got involved
Oh, my God.
because she was concerned about the verdict.
It's a big deal.
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting because it's not just about McNaughton and his crime anymore.
Right.
This case started a national debate about mental health in criminal justice, about how we figure out who's responsible and what kind of protections we need for the public and for people with mental illness.
So the Queen and the House of Lords basically put the judges in charge
Yeah.
of defining legal insanity,
Yeah.
which is a huge responsibility.
Right. It wasn't just about clarifying the law.
Yeah.
It was about setting a standard that would affect people for generations.
So from all this public and legal pressure, we got what we now know as the McNaughton Rule.
A McNaughton Rule, yeah.
Yeah.
And this rule made a very specific test for legal insanity based on two key questions.
Okay.
Did the defendant understand what they were doing
Okay.
when they committed the crime, and did they know it was wrong?
Right.
Yeah. And these questions became like the foundation for legal insanity definitions for decades, both in England and the US.
Wow.
But as you can imagine,
I can imagine.
figuring out the answers to those questions is really hard.
Yeah.
Like, you have to dive into the complexity of the human mind,
Right.
which was even harder to do back then.
Yeah. So basically, this one case,
Right.
this really specific situation, became like a legal cornerstone
Yeah.
that still affects how we look at mental health in our justice system.
Right. But it also brings up a lot of questions, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
The McNaughton Rule is great because it gives us a way to look at legal insanity.
Right.
But it has been debated and criticized a lot.
Right.
Some people say that it's too narrow.
Yeah.
It doesn't include all the different kinds of mental illnesses
Right.
and how they can affect what a person does.
Yeah.
Other people say it's too easy to use it as an excuse,
Yeah.
which means some people might get away with things.
Right. So while the McNaughton Rule was a big step forward, it wasn't the end of the story.
Yeah, it's just the beginning of a long and complicated conversation about how mental health and the law work together.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, the McNaughton Rule really set the stage for this really complex legal debate.
Yeah.
It's interesting how this rule from the 1800s, when mental health was viewed so differently, is still relevant
It is.
in the 21st century.
You're right. The McNaughton Rule has been praised for providing a clear standard, but also criticized
Yeah.
for being too rigid and outdated. It's like we're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, trying to apply this fixed definition to something as fluid and complex as the human mind.
And critics argue that the McNaughton Rules just focus on understanding right from wrong.
Right.
Doesn't really consider the whole range of mental illnesses and how they could affect someone's ability to control their actions. It's like saying just because someone knows stealing is wrong,
Right.
it means they can just automatically resist the urge to steal
Right.
if their mental illness is driving that urge.
It seems like it doesn't really consider situations where someone might know that their actions are wrong, but they still can't help but do them because of their mental state.
Yeah, that's one of the main criticisms. Like,
Yeah.
for example, someone with really severe OCD
Okay.
might understand that washing their hands over and over again
Right.
is too much. And it's disruptive, but their mental illness makes them do it anyway.
So it's not just about knowing what's right and wrong.
Right.
It's about being able to control what you do,
Exactly.
which some mental illnesses can really affect.
Exactly. And this is where the conversation about legal insanity gets even more complicated.
Right.
How can we tell if someone really couldn't control themselves
Right.
because of their mental state
Yeah.
versus someone who's just trying to manipulate the system?
Right.
It's a tough question, and it really highlights why we need to keep looking at and refining these legal standards.
It sounds like finding a good balance
Yeah.
between making sure victims get justice and making sure people with mental illness are treated fairly is a real challenge.
It definitely is. And this challenge is made even harder
Yeah.
by the fact that we're always learning more about mental health.
Right.
What might have been called insanity in the 1800s
Right.
could be diagnosed and treated totally differently today.
Right. We've come a long way from using terms like lunacy to recognizing a whole spectrum of conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and different kinds of psychosis.
Yeah. It's really important to remember that mental illness isn't just one thing.
Yeah.
It's a diverse spectrum
Yeah.
with different levels of severity
Yeah.
and different impacts on behavior.
So how has the legal system adapted to this new understanding of mental health?
Yeah.
Have there been attempts to update or change the McNaughton Rule?
There definitely have been.
Mhm.
Over the years,
Okay.
legal experts and mental health professionals have realized that the McNaughton Rule has some limits,
Right.
and they've suggested other ways to test for legal insanity.
Ugh.
One of these is the irresistible impulse test.
Oh, yeah. Can you explain how the irresistible impulse test works and how it's different from the McNaughton Rule?
So the irresistible impulse test acknowledges
Okay.
that even if someone understands that what they're doing is wrong,
Right.
they might still be driven by an impulse that they can't control
Okay.
because of their mental state. So basically, it's recognizing that mental illness doesn't necessarily mean someone doesn't know right from wrong,
Yeah.
but it can overpower their ability to actually act the right way.
That makes sense. It seems like a more nuanced approach,
It is.
taking into account that mental illness can show up in different ways.
Exactly. However, even this test has its own criticisms.
Okay.
Some argue that it's really hard to tell
Yeah.
if an impulse was really irresistible.
Yeah.
And this kind of subjectivity could lead to different interpretations.
Yeah.
And maybe even abuse.
It sounds like no matter how we try to define insanity in a legal way,
Yeah.
there are always going to be complications.
That's the hard part about trying to define something as complicated and changeable as the human mind.
Yeah.
And then use that definition in a legal setting.
Right.
The legal system has to deal with this ever-changing understanding of mental health.
Yeah.
While also making sure things are fair and just.
For everyone.
For everyone involved.
It sounds like a real balancing act.
It is. Are there any other alternatives to the McNaughton Rule?
Yeah. Are there any other?
That have been suggested or actually used?
Yeah.
There are. In the 20th century,
okay,
the Durham Rule came about. Sometimes it's called the product test.
Okay.
This rule was established in 1954.
Okay.
And it says that a defendant isn't responsible for a crime.
Okay.
If what they did was a result of a mental disease or defect.
So instead of just focusing on whether the defendant knew right from wrong,
Right.
the Durham Rule looks at whether their mental condition directly caused the crime?
Exactly. The Durham Rule tried to be broader.
Okay.
And consider the wider influence of mental illness on someone's actions. But it was also criticized for maybe being too broad.
Okay.
And potentially including a lot of behaviors that might not really justify an insanity defense.
So it seems like the legal system is constantly trying to find that perfect balance, a way to deal with mental illness in criminal cases. That's fair, and reflects how our understanding of the human mind is changing.
Yeah, it's a constant work in progress, this careful balance between legal principles and the complexities of human behavior. And this search for a more complete and nuanced approach led to another alternative, the Model Penal Code Test.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about that?
Sure.
What makes it different from the McNaughton and Durham rules?
The Model Penal Code Test combines parts of both the McNaughton Rule and the Irresistible Impulse Test.
Okay.
It says that a person isn't responsible for their actions.
Okay.
If because of a mental illness or defect at the time, they weren't really able to understand that what they were doing was wrong.
All right.
Or to control their actions according to the law.
It sounds like it's trying to be more comprehensive.
Right.
And consider both cognitive and volitional factors.
Exactly. The Model Penal Code Test aims to give a more thorough assessment of legal insanity, looking at both whether a person understood their actions and whether they could control them.
Has this approach been widely used?
Well, it has been influential.
Yeah.
And a lot of legal experts think it's a big step forward.
Yeah.
It hasn't been adopted everywhere. Some states in the U.S. have included parts of it in their laws. Okay. But it hasn't completely replaced the McNaughton Rule.
It seems like the legal system is still trying to figure out the best way to deal with mental health in criminal justice.
Yeah, you're right. It's a process that never ends.
Yeah.
It needs constant dialogue and debate.
Right.
And a willingness to rethink our old ideas.
It's really interesting how the McNaughton Rule, even though it's old and has limitations, is still part of these discussions.
Absolutely. It reminds us of the challenges and ethical considerations that come with defining legal insanity. It makes us think deeply about how to make sure justice is served while also acknowledging the realities of mental illness.
And this isn't just some abstract legal debate.
Right.
These legal precedents affect real people's lives. They shape how we see mental illness, how we treat people in the justice system, and how we define responsibility for criminal acts.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that behind all these legal terms and definitions are real people, real families and communities dealing with the complicated impacts of mental illness and crime.
We need to remember the human side of this story.
Yeah.
We've been talking about Daniel McNaughton and all the legal stuff that came from his case.
Yeah.
But what about the victims?
Right.
Their stories matter too.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to focus on the legal and ethical arguments about the insanity plea.
Yeah.
But we should never forget about the real human cost of these crimes.
It's a reminder that while we want justice, we also have to acknowledge the deep and lasting impact of these crimes on families and whole communities.
And that brings us to another important part of the McNaughton Rule's legacy.
Okay.
The question of responsibility. If someone is found not guilty by reason of insanity, who's responsible?
Yeah.
Is it only the individual?
Right.
Does society have any responsibility?
Yeah.
What about the mental health system?
Yeah.
These are big questions with no easy answer.
It's like we're peeling back the layers of a really complicated onion. And each layer just brings up more questions and challenges.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
The McNaughton Rule, with all its limitations,
Yeah.
has started important conversations
Yeah.
about law, mental health, and justice.
And these conversations are far from over.
They are.
In fact, they're more important than ever
as
we figure out how to deal with mental illness in the criminal justice system.
Exactly. It's not a simple issue.
It's not.
There are a lot of gray areas.
Yeah.
When you think about mental health and criminal behavior.
What might be considered insane in one situation could be seen completely differently in another. Wow. It really is amazing how a case from 1843 still affects how we think about mental health and law. This deep dive has shown just how complicated this issue is.
It is complex. And remember, these aren't just like theoretical conversations, right?
Right.
These legal definitions and all these precedents, they have a real impact on people, families, and communities.
Right.
They influence how we treat people who have mental illness.
Right.
How we decide who's responsible for a crime, and how our whole justice system works.
So after looking at the McNaughton Rule and all its alternatives, what are some of the key things you hope people listening will take away from this?
Well, I really hope that this deep dive has made people question some of their assumptions. And really think critically about how mental health and the law are connected. It's easy to think that there are simple black and white answers, but as we've seen, it's much more nuanced than that.
We've explored all these different legal tests for insanity: the McNaughton Rule, the irresistible impulse test, the Durham Rule, and the model penal code test. And each one has its own strengths and weaknesses.
Exactly. And even though there's no perfect solution, these different approaches show how we're always trying to find a balance between making sure justice is served and understanding how complex mental illness is.
What I think is really interesting is that these legal discussions make us think about really basic questions about human behavior responsibility and what justice actually means.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
How do we balance the need to hold people accountable?
Right.
With understanding that mental illness can make it really hard for someone to make rational choices or control what they do.
It's this constant back and forth, isn't it?
It is.
Trying to keep the public safe while also making sure people with mental illness are treated fairly and humanely.
It is, and it's going to keep being a challenge as we learn more about mental health. We're always learning new things about the brain, the effects of trauma, and how genetics and the environment work together.
So where do we go from here? What's next for mental health and the law? What should our listeners be thinking about after hearing all this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that we need to keep talking about this. We need to keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better way to handle mental health in the criminal justice system. One that's more nuanced and compassionate.
This isn't just for lawyers and judges to figure out. This affects everyone. Mental health is a public health issue.
It is.
And how we deal with it in our legal system shows what we value as a society.
I completely agree. We need to support better access to mental health services, better training for police officers and legal professionals, and a better understanding of mental illness in our communities.
I think the best question our listeners can ask themselves is, what's my role in this conversation?
Exactly.
How can I, as an individual, help create a more informed, compassionate, and just way of handling mental health in the legal system?
That's a great question. We can start by educating ourselves, challenging stigma,
and supporting policies and practices that promote both justice and understanding.
This deep dive has been a real journey.
It has.
Through history, law, and the complexities of the human mind. We started with the McNaughton Rule, looking at where it came from, how it's been used, its limitations, and this ongoing search for a better way to address mental health and criminal justice.
And even though we don't have all the answers, I hope this exploration has given you some insights and things to think about.
We encourage you to keep this conversation going, keep learning, and think about how you can help create a more just and compassionate world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.